Creativity is trial and error, but not random. Campbell's blind variation and selective retention theory, BVSR. Here's something that sounds almost insulting when you first hear it. Your best creative ideas probably came from a process that looks a lot like trial and error. Not systematic, not logical, not the result of applied genius working methodically toward known goal, but more like generating a bunch of possibilities, most of which don't work until one does. That's not exactly the romantic story of creative inspiration we tell ourselves. But a psychologist named Donald Campbell built a theory around exactly this idea. And it turns out to be one of the most powerful frameworks for understanding why creativity works the way it does. The theory is called BVSR, blind variation and selective retention. And once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere. Who is Campbell? Donald Campbell was a psychologist ranked among the 20 most eminent of the post-WWII era, above Howard Gardner, Robert Sternberg, J.P. Guilford. His main contribution to science was in methodology. He basically wrote the handbook on how to design experiments and evaluate evidence. But in 1960, he published a paper on creativity that would generate debate for the next 6 decades. It argued that creative thought, all of it, from scientific discovery to artistic invention, operates according to a 2-step principle. Generate variations you can't fully predict the value of, then select and keep the ones that work. Blind variation, selective retention, BVSR. The core idea. Start with a simple question. How do you find something you don't know how to find? If you already knew the answer, it wouldn't be a creative discovery. It would just be retrieval. You'd reach for it the way you reach for a word you know. High probability, predictable result, routine. The moment you're genuinely in creative territory, you're working without that safety net. The thing you're looking for hasn't been found yet. Its value is unknown. You can't calculate your way to it, which means any process you use to get there is necessarily operating with some degree of ignorance about where it's going. That ignorance is what Campbell means by blindness, not randomness. That's a common misconception. Random and blind are not the same thing. A systematic search is blind. Analogy-driven heuristic is blind. Mind-wandering is blind. Serendipity is blind. They're all building in the same way. The utility of what you're generating isn't known in advance. You're generating possibilities without certainty about which one will pay off. And that blindness, Campbell argues, isn't a bug. It's the necessary structure of any genuinely creative process. The more creative the output, the more blind the process that produced it had to be. 3 variables. Dean Simonton, the researcher who has done the most to formalize and extend Campbell's theory, breaks this down into 3 parameters for any given idea you generate. Probability. How likely was this idea to come to mind? A familiar solution comes with high probability. A genuinely novel combination is low probability. Originality is essentially the inverse of probability. the less likely the idea was to occur to you, the more original it is. Utility. How useful is it? Does it work? Does it solve the problem, achieve the goal, satisfy the criteria? Prior knowledge of that utility before you've tested the idea, before you've run the experiment, played the chord, tried the sentence. How much do you already know about whether it's going to work? Creativity in Simonton's formalization is the product of all three: high originality, high utility, and crucially, surprise. The creator didn't know it was going to work. That surprise isn't incidental to the creativity. It's constitutive of it. An idea can be original and useful without being creative. If you already knew it was going to be useful, that's a competent prediction, not a discovery. What makes something genuinely creative is the combination. Unlikely, worked, and you didn't fully see it coming. Which means, in a certain sense, in maximizing creativity, ignorance is bliss. Sighted versus blind. The opposite of a blind variation is a sighted one. A perfectly sighted variation is one where you already know what's going to work. So you go straight there. High probability, high utility, full prior knowledge. That's expertise. That's algorithm. That's plugging numbers into a formula. And expertise is enormously valuable. The world runs on it. But sighted variations, by definition, can't be creative because there's nothing surprising about them. You expected them to work, they did, end of story. Creativity requires moving beyond what's already known, not throwing expertise out. The domain still matters enormously, as we explored in the systems model video. But using it as a launching point to generate variations that go beyond what expertise alone can guarantee, you use what you know to get to the edge, and then you have to step into uncertainty. The mathematician uses everything she knows to approach an unsolved problem, and then has to generate conjectures she can't yet verify. The novelist draws on craft and observation, and then has to write sentences whose effect she can only partly predict. The scientist runs on established methods and then designs an experiment whose result is genuinely open. All of those edge of expertise moments involve blind variation, and all of them require selective retention. Generating possibilities, evaluating them, and keeping the ones that survive. How this connects to the creative process. In the flow video, you heard about the 5 stages of the creative process: preparation, incubation, insight, evaluation, elaboration, which trace back to Graham Wallace's 1926 model. BVSR gives you a different lens on the same territory. Less phenomenological, more structural. What is actually happening in each stage? Incubation is blind variation without conscious direction. The insight is a high utility, blind variation breaking through into awareness. The surprise that confirms the blindness was real. Evaluation is selective retention, the filter deciding what's worth keeping. Elaboration is a long recursive process of more variation and more selection all the way to the finished work. BVSR doesn't replace that picture. It explains why it has that structure. Incubation is valuable because relaxing consciousness control lets combinations form that wouldn't survive the filter of directed thinking. The aha moment is surprising by definition. If you'd seen it coming, it wouldn't have needed incubation. Elaboration takes so long because the work keeps generating new problems that require new blind searches. The volume argument, one of the most empirically supported implications of BVSR, is what Simonton calls variation superfluidity. The more creative the output, the more variations had to be generated and discarded to get there. This shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. Edison tested thousands of filament materials before finding one that worked for the light bulb. Picasso made 45 preparatory sketches for Guernica, and they don't converge steadily towards the final version. They zigzag. Elements appear, disappear, reappear transformed. Darwin's theory of evolution accumulated over years in disconnected fragments. Elizabeth Bishop wrote over a dozen heavily marked up drafts of her 19-line poem, One Art, with words, images, and even the poem's form changing across drafts. This is what BVS predicts. If you already knew what you were doing, you wouldn't need all those attempts. Quality is a probabilistic function of quantity, not because volume automatically produces quality, but because without generating a sufficient number of blind variations, you're unlikely to stumble across the one with high utility you couldn't have predicted in advance. Linus Pauling put it simply when a student asked him how he came up with so many good ideas. Have lots of ideas and throw away the bad ones. That's BVSR in one sentence. The personality angle, BVSR, also has something interesting to say about why certain people are more creative than others. Not in terms of raw talent, but personality and developmental background. Domains that depend heavily on BVSR, the arts, the social sciences, philosophy, tend to produce creative work from people high in openness to experience. Openness correlates with cognitive disinhibitions. Cognitive disinhibitions, a reduced tendency to filter out loosely related ideas before they reach consciousness. Open people let more variations through before the selection filter kicks in. More gets generated, including more that's useless, but also more that's surprising and valuable. And in terms of development, Campbell himself noted that people exposed to multiple cultures, unconventional experiences, or disruptions to their normal environment tend to show higher creative capacity. The logic is BVSR, consistent, diverse, and unusual experiences expand the pool of variations you can generate, because you've been exposed to combinations that wouldn't be available to someone who stayed in a single context. Diversifying experiences aren't just interesting, they're literally feeding the variation machine. The real objection, the instinctive pushback against BVSR, is usually some version of, but creative people aren't just guessing. They have expertise, they have intention, they know what they're doing, and that's true. BVSR doesn't deny it. The theory is specifically about what happens at the edge of expertise. The moment when what you know isn't enough to get you where you need to go. At that moment, no amount of expertise will hand you the answer. You have to venture into territory where you don't know in advance what will work. Dennett put it well. You can use scaffolding, but not sky hooks. Expertise and domain knowledge are scaffolding. They get you higher, they constrain the search space, they help you evaluate what you find. But at the top of the scaffold, there's no shortcut to the creative leap. There's only the blind step and the question of whether what you land on is worth keeping. As Einstein apparently confessed, most of my intellectual offspring end up very young in the graveyard of disappointed hopes. That's not a failure of genius. That's BVSR working exactly as it should. BVSR is not a flattening theory of creativity. It doesn't tell you that creative people have a special gift or that great work emerges from the focused application of mastery. It tells you that at the moment of genuine discovery, the moment when something genuinely new enters the world, even the most brilliant creator is operating with uncertainty about where they're going. The creative process is a search through a space that isn't fully mapped for something whose value you can't fully predict in advance. That search requires generating more possibilities than you'll keep, following paths that don't pan out, and staying in the uncertainty long enough for something surprising to emerge. What separates the highly creative isn't that they bypass this process. It's that they've built the domain knowledge to search efficiently, develop the judgment to evaluate quickly, and crucially, have a high enough tolerance for uncertainty to keep generating blind variations long after a less persistent person would stop. Creativity emerges out of ignorance. That was Campbell's insight. And it turns out to be one of the most honest and practically useful things anyone has said about how the creative mind actually works.